The rope was a living thing. It bit into the skin of her wrists, its fibers coarse and dry like the dust that settled on her bare feet. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the crown of her head, bleaching the world to the color of rust and bone. She kept her eyes on the hitching post in front of her, on the way the wood was splintered and gray, worn smooth in patches by years of rains and ropes just like this one. To look up was to see the faces, and the faces were worse than the sun. They swam in the heat haze, a shifting mural of judgment. Some were hard with contempt, others soft with a pity that felt just as sharp. Men in dusty hats, women with their arms crossed, their mouths tight lines of disapproval. Children pointed, their curiosity unblunted by shame. Their murmurs were a low, constant hum, the sound of insects buzzing over something left to die. A voice, thick and slick like cheap oil, cut through the haze. Strong back on her. Good for farm work or whatever else you've a mind for. Won't give no trouble. It was Silas, the man who had been her stepfather for 5 years, ever since her mother's lungs had filled with dust and given out. His words were another rope, wrapping around her, defining her. A tool. A body. A thing to be bartered for the price of a few bottles or a new saddle. She felt a hollowness inside her, a vast and empty space where a name used to be. He had taken that too. In this town, in this moment, she was just the girl. She had learned long ago that silence was a shield. She made her body still, her breathing shallow. She retreated to a place deep inside herself, a small, dark room where the noise and the heat could not reach. She focused on the feel of a loose pebble under her heel, the way a single strand of her frayed brown hair tickled her cheek. Small things, real things. Then, through the blur of heat and indifference, a shape detached itself from the wall of the general store. He was tall, so tall the sun seemed to hesitate before striking his shoulders. He moved with a quiet economy that made the fidgeting of the other townsfolk seem frantic. He wore no hat, and his black hair was tied back with a simple leather thong. His face was broad, carved from some harder, more patient stone than the men around him. He was Apache, that much was clear from the high cheekbones and the copper tint of his skin, a fact that drew a new, sharper kind of murmur from the crowd. He did not look at the other men. His eyes, dark and still as a deep well, settled on her. She felt the weight of his gaze not as an intrusion, but as an anchor. It was the first time all day anyone had looked at her, the person inside the humiliation, and not the spectacle she represented. He carried whole winters in his eyes, a landscape of loss that she recognized in her own desolate way. Silas, seeing a potential customer, puffed out his chest. "See something you like, Chief? She's cheap. Debt needs paying." The tall man's gaze did not waver from her. He took another slow step forward, the dust barely stirring around his worn boots. The crowd shifted, making a space for him, their hostility mixed with a grudging respect born of his sheer presence. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over her, offering a sliver of relief from the relentless sun. He looked from her face to the ropes on her wrists, and a muscle worked in his jaw. He didn't speak to Silas. He spoke into the air between them, his voice low and steady, a sound like stones settling at the bottom of a river. "I'll take her." Silas grinned, a flash of yellowed teeth. "Now we're talking. The price is $20. Hard coin." The tall man reached into a pouch at his belt without breaking his gaze. He pulled out a handful of coins, their silver and copper glinting in the harsh light. He didn't count them. He simply walked to Silas and dropped the heavy weight into his outstretched, greedy palm. The sound was final, a dull thud that sealed a bargain she had no part in. Silas's eyes widened at the amount, more than he had asked for. He closed his fist around the money, his victory immediate and absolute. "She's all yours." The tall man turned his back on Silas as if he had already ceased to exist. He walked to the hitching post. She flinched, expecting a rough hand, a tug on the rope. Instead, he pulled a small, sharp knife from his belt. The blade caught the sun for a brief, blinding moment. With two swift, clean motions, he sliced through the ropes at her wrists. The fibers fell away, leaving raw, red lines on her skin. Freed, she stumbled, her legs weak. She wrapped her arms around herself, a reflexive gesture of protection. He did not touch her. He simply stood back, giving her space, his stillness a question. He gestured with his head toward the edge of town, a silent command that was also an invitation. She looked at his face one more time, searching for the trick, the hidden cruelty. She found only that profound, wintry sadness and a resolve as solid as the mountains on the horizon. Taking a shaky breath, she turned away from the gawking crowd and the man who had sold her, and she followed him. The journey was a silent one. He walked ahead, his stride long and even, yet he kept a pace she could manage. The dust of the town gave way to the hard-packed earth of the open plains. The wind turned mean, whipping her thin dress against her legs and throwing grit into her eyes. The world was vast and empty out here, the sky a pitiless, bleached blue. The dust they kicked up lifted behind them like ghosts of the people they were leaving behind. She kept her eyes on his back. It was a wide, protective shape against the unforgiving landscape. He was a wall between her and everything that had come before. For hours, no words passed between them. The only sounds were the scuff of their boots, the whine of the wind, and the frantic beating of her own heart. When the sun began to dip toward the jagged teeth of the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple, he finally stopped. He shrugged a pack from his shoulder and pulled out a metal canteen. He didn't speak. He just uncapped it and held it out to her. She stared at it for a long moment. It was the first true kindness she had been offered in years, a simple, unadorned gesture that felt monumental. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. The metal was cool against her palm. She lifted it to her lips, the water shockingly cold and clean, washing the dust from her throat. She drank until her stomach ached, then handed it back. He nodded once, took a short drink himself and capped it. The silent transaction was a promise. They walked on as dusk settled, the air growing colder. Just as she felt her legs would give out completely, she saw it. A cabin, nestled in a shallow dip of the land, almost invisible until you were upon it. It was small, made of dark, weathered logs chinked with mud. A thin curl of old smoke ghosted from its stone chimney. It looked as lonely and resilient as the man who led her to it. Beside the cabin, under a lone, twisted juniper tree, was a single, well-tended grave marked by a simple wooden cross. There were no words on it, but she felt its story in the air. This was the source of the winter in his eyes. He pushed the heavy plank door open. It didn't creak. The inside was dim, smelling of wood smoke, pine, and something else. Emptiness. It was sparse but clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a bedroll and a few blankets neatly folded on a low cot against the other. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. It was the home of a man who lived with ghosts. He gestured toward the cot. "You sleep there," his voice was rough from disuse. She nodded, clutching her arms. He moved to the hearth, where embers still glowed faintly. He added a few pieces of wood, and soon a small fire crackled to life, pushing back the encroaching shadows. He put a pot over the flames, adding water from a bucket and some dried meat and vegetables from a sack. He worked without looking at her, but she felt his awareness of her in the room. He was not ignoring her. He was giving her the gift of being unobserved. When the stew was ready, he ladled it into 2 wooden bowls. He set one on the table for her along with a spoon. He took his own and sat not at the table, but on the floor by the fire, his back to her. She hesitated, then crept to the table. The stew was hot and savory, and she ate with a desperate hunger that shamed her. When she was done, she didn't know what to do with the bowl. She just sat there, listening to the fire spit and hiss. After a long silence, his voice came from the fireside, low and calm. "The door has no lock. I don't lock doors." It was the most important thing he could have said. It wasn't a promise of comfort, but one of freedom. She was not his prisoner. She could leave if she chose. A knot of terror she hadn't even realized she was holding deep in her belly began to loosen. She curled up on the cot, pulling a coarse wool blanket over herself. For the first time in more than a week, she closed her eyes without the fear of what the morning would bring. The fire only changed everything if something new was waiting in the ash. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm, measured not by a clock but by the sun's journey across the sky. Their lives became a silent dance of shared space and parallel tasks. He would rise before dawn, the soft scrape of his boots on the floorboards her signal to wake. He would already have the fire going, its warmth a welcome presence in the cold morning air. He never told her what to do. There were no orders, no expectations spoken aloud. But she was an observer and she learned the shape of his life. She saw the way he mended a broken fence post, his large hands surprisingly deft with the wire. She watched him chop wood, the axe falling with a clean, powerful thud that echoed in the vast quiet. His work was his language. So she found her own. The cabin floor, packed earth though it was, she swept each morning until it was smooth and clear of debris. She learned where he kept the meager supplies and began to prepare the evening meal, a simple stew or a coarse bread baked in a pan near the fire. The first loaf she made was hard as a rock. He ate his piece without complaint, his expression unchanging. When she threw the rest of the loaf into the fire, he glanced over. "That loaf died in vain," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching almost imperceptibly. It was the closest thing to a joke she had ever heard him make. The next loaf was better. He would leave for hours at a time, hunting or checking traps. She was always left alone, the door unlocked. The first few times, a panicked bird beat its wings in her chest. The silence of the plains was immense, a heavy blanket that could smother you. But he always returned, a brace of rabbits or a bird slung over his shoulder, his presence filling the small cabin, making it feel safe again. Small gestures became their only conversation. One evening, a sharp wind blew down from the mountains, rattling the cabin. She shivered by the fire, her thin dress offering little protection. Without a word, he rose and fetched a heavy wool shawl from a wooden chest. It was finely woven, with faded patterns of blue and red. It smelled of cedar and thyme. He draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was a comfort, a solid, tangible piece of care. She pulled it tighter around herself, the wool scratching softly against her chin. A week later, while gathering firewood, she found a patch of stubborn blue wildflowers clinging to life in the lee of a rock. She picked one, its color a startling jewel against the brown landscape. On her way back to the cabin, she stopped at the grave under the juniper tree. Hesitantly, she knelt and laid the small flower on the packed earth of the mound. It was a tiny offering, a whisper of acknowledgement for the ghost that lived with them. That evening, as he sat by the fire mending a strap of leather, he looked at her for a long time. His eyes were not filled with their usual winter. There was something else there, something softer. He didn't mention the flower. He didn't have to. The real shift came on a moonless night. A dream clawed its way out of her memory, a nightmare of Silas's face, his greasy voice, the feeling of a locked door and suffocating darkness. She woke with a gasp, a scream caught in her throat, her body trembling. The terror was so real she could taste it, metallic and sour. A shadow moved in the doorway to the main room. It was him, a massive silhouette against the dying orange of the fire's embers. He stood there unmoving. "You hurt." His voice was a low rumble. She shook her head, pulling the shawl tighter, unable to form words. She was back in that small, dark pantry Silas used to lock her in. Don't lock me in," she whispered, the words thin as a fence rail. He was silent for a long moment. She could feel him watching her, his gaze steady in the gloom. "I told you," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I don't lock doors." He didn't move to comfort her, didn't cross the space between them. He simply stood witness to her fear, and in doing so, he lessened it. He remained in the doorway until her trembling subsided and her breathing evened out. He was a sentinel, guarding not just the cabin, but the fragile peace she was beginning to build inside herself. The bond between them deepened in that shared darkness, stitched together with raw thread in the quiet of a house that was slowly learning to breathe again. The peace they had built was as fragile as a desert flower. It bloomed in isolation, but the wider world was never truly gone. It was just over the horizon. The harbinger of its return came not as a letter or a lone rider, but as a smudge of dust in the far distance, a sign that meant more than one horse, more than one man. She saw it first from the small patch of earth she had started to turn over for a garden. Her hands, calloused now and stained with soil, went still. The hoe dropped from her grip. Her blood ran cold. She didn't have to say anything. He had seen it too. He stood on the small porch of the cabin, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on the approaching cloud. The easy posture of routine was gone, replaced by a coiled tension, the stillness of a wolf that has scented danger. She ran to the cabin, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He met her at the door, his expression grim. "Go inside," he said. It wasn't a command born of dominance, but of protection. She hesitated. "It's him." "I know," he said, his voice flat. He took a heavy rifle that rested against the wall and checked its mechanism with an practiced economy of motion. The riders grew from smudges into distinct shapes. 3 of them. Silas was in the lead, his posture arrogant even on horseback. He had brought 2 other men, rough-looking sorts with mean eyes and guns on their hips. They stopped just beyond the makeshift fence she and the tall man had repaired together, their horses shifting and blowing in the quiet air. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. Silas swung down from his horse, a sneer twisting his lips. He ignored the tall man completely, his eyes locking onto her where she stood in the cabin doorway. "There you are," he said, his voice carrying easily in the stillness. "Got tired of playing house with the savage? I've come to take you back. The deal wasn't what I thought. I was cheated." The tall man stepped forward, moving from the porch to the hard-packed earth of the yard. He didn't raise the rifle. He held it loosely at his side, but its presence was a clear and potent threat. He stood directly between Silas and the cabin door. "She is not going anywhere," he said. His voice was quiet, but it had the weight of the stones beneath their feet. Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She is. She's my property. My stepdaughter. There are laws. I've come to claim what's mine." He took a step toward the fence line, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "You can't just steal a man's family. You sold her," the tall man stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "The deal is done. The deal is void." Silas spat. "I'm taking her. Now get out of my way, Injun, before you get hurt." The air crackled. The 2 men with Silas shifted, their hands moving closer to their guns. The world shrank to this small patch of land, this yard that had become a sanctuary, now a battleground. She felt the old, familiar ice of fear creep into her veins, threatening to paralyze her, to steal her voice and her will. She felt the cabin door at her back, a solid thing. She thought of the wildflower on the grave, the warmth of the shawl, the steady sound of his breathing in the night. This was not Silas's world anymore. This was hers. As Silas took another step forward, his hand reaching for the fence gate, something broke inside her. It was not fear, but a white-hot surge of pure rage. The girl who had stood numbly at a hitching post was gone. She stepped out of the doorway and into the sunlight, moving to stand beside the tall man. Her chin was up, her eyes blazing. "No," she said. Her voice was not thin or wavering. It was clear and sharp as shattered glass. Silas stopped, startled to hear her speak, to see her defy him. "You keep your mouth shut, girl. This is between men. He is not my father," she declared, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You are not my family. This?" She swept a hand back toward the small cabin, the grave, the endless sky. "This is my home." The tall man glanced at her, a flicker of something fierce and proud in his eyes. He didn't smile, but he didn't need to. In that moment, they were no longer two separate, lonely people. They were a single, unyielding front. Silas's face contorted with fury. He ripped the pistol from his holster. "I don't care what you think. You're coming with me." Before he could raise the gun, the tall man brought his rifle up. The click of the hammer being cocked was deafening in the silence. He didn't aim it at Silas's chest. He aimed it at the ground just in front of his feet. "Set one foot on this land," he said, his voice a deadly whisper, "and you will not leave it." The air was thick with the promise of violence. Silas stared down the barrel of the rifle, his bravado beginning to crack. His two hired men looked at each other, their enthusiasm for the fight suddenly gone. They were paid to bully, not to die. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement on the ridge behind Silas. Two figures on horseback, neighbors from a homestead miles away. They were just watching, rifles held across their saddles, silent witnesses who had perhaps heard the shouting on the wind. Their presence tipped the scale. Silas was not just facing a lone Apache anymore. He was facing a community, however small and distant. He saw them too. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a sullen, impotent rage. He was a coward at his core, a bully who only fought when the odds were stacked in his favor. He holstered his pistol with a jerky movement. "This ain't over," he snarled, but the threat was hollow. He swung himself back onto his horse, yanking the reins with unnecessary force. He and his men turned and rode away, their retreat kicking up a cloud of angry dust that soon settled back into the profound quiet of the plains. They stood there together, watching until the riders were nothing more than specks on the horizon. The tension slowly bled out of the air, leaving behind an exhausted calm. The rifle in his hands was lowered. She was trembling, the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. He turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face. He reached out, not with a comforting hug, but with a simple, solid gesture. His large, warm hand came to rest on her shoulder. The contact was electric, grounding her. "You didn't run," he said, his voice low. She looked up at him, at the man who had bought her, sheltered her, and now stood ready to die for her. "I was already home," she whispered. His hand tightened on her shoulder for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them, everything they had become. That night, the fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter, warmer. The confrontation had shattered the quiet routine, but in its place, something stronger had been forged. The space between them was no longer filled with silence, but with an unspoken understanding. They sat at the small table together, sharing a meal, the comfortable scrape of spoons against wood the only sound. After they ate, he did not retreat to his usual spot by the fire. He remained at the table, watching her as she cleared the bowls. The house felt different. It was no longer his house where she was a guest. It was theirs. He waited until she sat down again, her hands clasped in her lap. The firelight danced across the planes of his face, softening the harsh lines. "Silas," he began, the name tasting like poison in the small room. "He called you his stepdaughter. But he never called you by a name." He looked at her, a direct question in his deep-set eyes. "What did your mother call you?" She stared into the flames, thinking back to a time before Silas, a time of small kindnesses and a mother's soft voice. But that life felt like it belonged to someone else, a ghost from a distant land. The girl who had answered to that name had died at the hitching post. "She's gone," she said, her voice barely audible. "That name is gone with her." He nodded slowly, as if he understood completely. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not at the survivor or the victim, but at the woman who had stood beside him and claimed her own life. "A person needs a name," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It is how the world knows you. It is how you know yourself." He was silent for a long time, his gaze thoughtful. "I will call you Lena." Lena. The name felt strange and new on her tongue. It was a clean slate, a name with no history of pain attached to it. It was not given in ownership, but in recognition. It was a gift. Lena, she repeated, tasting the sound of it. A slow smile, the first true smile she had felt in years, touched her lips. I like it. A few days later, she took the tattered, frayed dress she had arrived in, the one that carried the dust and humiliation of the town, and she walked to the fire pit outside. Without ceremony, she dropped it into the flames. She watched as the fabric blackened, curled, and turned to ash, the smoke rising into the vast, open sky. It was the funeral for the girl without a name. Lena stood and watched until the last ember died out, feeling lighter than she had in her entire life. Their life settled into a new kind of peace, one that was deeper and more resilient than before. The next spring, he helped her build a low stone wall around her garden. They worked side by side, lifting the heavy rocks, fitting them together. Their hands would brush, and a current would pass between them, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. One evening, as twilight settled over the plains and the first stars pricked the deep purple sky, they sat together on the small porch he had built. She was mending one of his shirts, her needle moving with a steady, practiced rhythm. He was carving a piece of wood, the shavings falling at his feet. A comfortable silence stretched between them, full of the quiet hum of a shared life. She looked at him, at the strong lines of his profile against the fading light, at the gentle way his large hands handled the small piece of wood. You're either the kindest man I've ever met, she said softly, or the most foolish. He stopped carving and looked at her, a rare, genuine smile touching his eyes. Can't I be both? He asked. She smiled back, a warmth spreading through her chest that felt like home. The cabin behind them was no longer a hollow, lonely place. It was full. It breathed with them. The wind that swept across the plains no longer sounded like a lament, sounded like a song. They sat there together, two broken pieces that had found a way to make a whole, watching the stars burn bright in the endless dark. This story, it isn't just about a rescue from a dusty street. It's about a rescue from a deeper kind of prison. The kind you carry inside you, the one built from being told you are worthless, that you are a thing to be used and discarded. It's about the profound, world-altering power of being seen. Not just looked at, but truly seen, for the strength that hides beneath the scars. It's the story of how a person can be given back to themselves. It happens in the quiet moments, in a shared bowl of stew, in the weight of a warm blanket, in the space left by an unlocked door. It happens when someone stands between you and the ghosts of your past and says, with a voice as solid as the earth, no further. So here's your naming. Maybe you've felt a winter in your own soul, a silence where a name used to be. Maybe you've stood at your own kind of hitching post, waiting for the world to decide your worth. The tale of Nakai and Lena is a reminder that kindness isn't always soft. Sometimes it's fierce. Sometimes it's a quiet man with a rifle and a steady hand. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept the name someone offers you and burn the rags of the person you used to be. Look for the helpers, the quiet ones, the ones who offer you a canteen of clean water without asking for anything in return. And if you are brave enough to follow them, if you are strong enough to stand with them when the past comes knocking, you might just find that fire only changes everything if something new, something true, is waiting there in the ash. You might just find a home,